Stetler, president of Hope Sound Bible College, evangelist, speaker, preacher. God's blessed him over the years in his ministry, and it's our delight to have him be the ordination speaker this year. God bless you, Brother Stetler, as you speak.
It's my happy privilege to be a part of this ordination service. In fact, this is the third ordination service that I've been a part of, that I've had the privilege of having a part in this summer, and that excites me. In one there were 4, in the other 2 there are 3, and today I understand there should have been, or they wanted there to be another one. Steve Kearney from Colorado had hoped to be ordained today and wasn't able to be here. I was with him last week in camp meeting. But it thrills me to know that there are young men and women who are committing themselves to God and going on record and stepping up to the line and saying, I want to be ordained. I want to be set apart, set aside to this very special ministry. Today I want to look and direct your attention to the writings of the Apostle Paul. He is coming down to the end of his life. And as he's moving to this point, he has prepared himself and prepared others to take on his responsibility. He knows the end is coming. For he says to Timothy, I'm now ready to be offered. Time of my departure is at hand. I've fought a good fight. I've finished the course. I've kept my faith. And henceforth there's laid up for me a crown of righteousness. But there's also a sense of urgency and pathos in Paul's writings to Timothy, because he undoubtedly feels, as some of you have, as I know I have, as you look back across your life, you see the challenges, you see the threats, you see the imminent dangers, you see the responsibility, and you look at younger people coming behind you and you say, oh, I hope you realize what this cost. I hope you realize what you have. I hope you realize how important it is that you step up. And we see that coming through his writings throughout 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And as Paul comes to the end of the first epistle in chapter 6 and verse 20, he says these words, "O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust. Avoid profane and vain babblings and the opposition of science, falsely so called, which some professing have erred concerning the faith. Grace be with you. Amen." As I look at those concluding words of 1 Timothy, the first thing that captures my attention is something that Paul doesn't specifically spell out. He just says, "O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust." He doesn't define here exactly what that is, but if you go back and look at his writings, you'll see that he mentions some things over and over and over, and one of those is that he mentions doctrine 8 different times in these 2 short epistles. 4 times he precedes that word doctrine with the word sound. 11 times he talks about the truth. 26 times in these 2 little books he talks about faith or the faith. 10 of those times he specifically describes it as the faith. And so I'm suggesting to you today that Paul was saying to Timothy, oh, keep sound doctrine. Keep the faith that I've been preaching. Keep that has been committed to thy trust. Paul was not saying to Timothy, keep all of the property that I've acquired. Keep all of the wealth that has come in through this ministry. Keep the contacts. Keep the access that's been granted. And today, gentlemen and ladies, we don't offer you majestic cathedrals. We don't offer you ivory covered towers of great seminaries. We don't offer you vast financial reserves. But we do offer you sound doctrine. We do offer you a message that still changes lives. We've seen it in this camp meeting. We do offer you a biblical solution for the sin problem. We do offer you something that is incredibly important, far beyond any material things we might present to you. And ladies and gentlemen, today I hope you realize that if these and others who will follow, if these who are supporting them today ever lose the truth, it doesn't matter what else we have. It doesn't matter how wealthy we are. It doesn't matter our access. It doesn't matter our contacts. It doesn't matter whose television show we're on, friend. If you lose the truth, you lose the heart and soul, the essence of what it means to be a preacher of the gospel. For our preaching only has validity as it is preaching the truth, preaching the word. Paul said to Timothy, preach the word, be instant in season, out of season. Keep that which is committed to you. The second thing that strikes me in this is the enormity of the task. You have an entrusted treasure, but you've got a tremendous task given to you. And the task is, keep it. This is your watch. This is your time. This is your day. Every day is different than the ones that precede, but every day of every generation of God's missionary preachers that have ever lived has had its own unique challenges. You know that. And they will soon know that. The idea of keeping comes from a Greek word which means to watch, to guard, to preserve, to save, hence to keep. So there's a certain defensive emphasis here. Don't be quick to accept new ideas. Don't be quick to jump on new bandwagons. Be a little skeptical about anybody who's got brand new light that's totally different from anything you've ever known before. You're keeping a treasure. You're keeping it. I'm not saying there's never a place for us to learn or to grow. I'm not saying there's never a place where we will understand perhaps some things that we haven't understood before. But friend, you got to remember, this is a treasure. We're not playing with it. This is a treasure. We're not bartering on it. It's not up for sale. Keep, guard, preserve. And Paul is groaning out to Timothy. Oh, Timothy, keep what has been committed to your trust. Keep it. Paul clearly realizes here that this young man, Timothy, and his co-worker Titus, and others who will carry on his ministry are people who are going to face persecution. And I wish I could tell you that the future has no persecution for you, but it may. Settle it in your heart today that whatever comes, whatever goes, your mind is made up, your heart is fixed, your soul is on fire for God, and it's not for Satan. He knew that these young men would be challenged by the brilliant minds of the learning centers around the ancient world, that they would come up for every reason to believe that Jesus didn't really walk in human flesh, that it was only an aberration. He knew that they would come up with great elaborate theories such as Gnosticism. But he said, keep the treasure. Keep the treasure. So there's a strong element of guarding here. But it dawned on me as I began to study this passage that keeping the treasure is not just guarding it. Because you can keep purity and it can die with you. Nobody that follows will know it because you never told anybody. Paul is concerned about that. So part of the keeping here is a proactive focus on transmission. Listen to what he says in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5. When I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that is in thee, which dwelt first in thy grandmother Lois and thy mother Eunice, and I am persuaded in thee also. He's saying, they handed you a well-lit torch. It came from your grandmother, and she passed it to your mother. And your mother has passed it on to you, and I've joined with her. We've given you a well-lit torch. But it doesn't stop there. Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2, the things that you have heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. Paul is saying, you've got to keep the purity of this treasure. You've got to keep this sound doctrine. You've got to keep this truth intact. You've got to guard it with your life every day of your life. But you've got to pass it on to others. That's the reason we're ordaining you. That's the reason we've examined you. We've instructed you. You've been through the school. We believe with all of our hearts that you're prepared to step up and take your place in the army of God and march on. And the day will come when your hair will be gray like mine. The day will come when the years will fall away so quickly and you'll pass it on to others. But may God ever help that the vision of that man, which was passed on, and for 50 years, John Zeckman has carried that on. What an incredible coincidence. No, what an incredible divine design that he who has spent 50 years spent a big chunk of that right here training young men and women for ministry. There aren't many conservative holiness denominations that have the lengthy heritage you have. And the fact that we stand here today essentially believing the founding principles that Brother Straub and others taught is incredible. That's wonderful. But every generational crossing is an opportunity to lose that sound doctrine. Every new generation that comes along is a chance for the devil to get somebody to say, oh, well, I really think we ought to rethink this. I would simply say to you, keep that torch lit. Keep your eyes focused. Keep your heart ablaze. Carry it every day of your life. Guard it with your very existence and pass it on to somebody else. Teach kids, teach young people, teach moms and dads, teach new converts. And when your turn comes to stand here and preach an ordination message, look them in the eye and tell them, we're giving you a treasure. You keep it. The reason Paul is urging this on them is because there not only is an entrusted treasure and an enormous task, but there's an imminent danger. He says there's the danger of profane and vain babblings. The word for profane means base, low. The only trouble is it never wears that garb. It always professes to be high and mighty and intellectual. Vain babblings, empty, full of sound but with no content. The problem is summed up with falsely named science. You want to find unbelief at its unmixed, purest form. You go to a seminary and find a place where they've let go of their belief in the authority of Scripture. And they've let go of their belief in the cardinal doctrines of the Christian faith. And they've let go of their confidence that God is real and that God can change men. And their high, soaring orations. They're incredibly intelligent people, but there's vastly empty content. There's nothing to preach, nothing to give. Oh yes, we've plugged that emptiness with calls to nuclear disarmament, fight against world hunger and racism and systemic racism. We find all kind of high and mighty suggestions, but friend, at the root of all human problems is the problem of sin. And if you don't believe in the doctrine of sin, you don't have anything, any tool in your bag to deal with the deep problems of mankind. The problem is sin. The answer is grace. The reason is Christ. Guard the treasure. Don't let any vain babblings He warns that if you let these vain babblings, this falsely named science, if you let it come in, it'll have devastating effects. In 2 Timothy 2:16, he says again, this is another time where he says this in his epistles, but shun profane and vain babblings, for they will increase unto more ungodliness, and their words will eat as doth a canker, of whom are Hymenaeus and Philetus. He said, well, Paul, that wasn't very Christian to call people out by name. If we're not careful, we're going to let the devil tie our hands so tight with being Christ-like when we don't even know how important the treasure is. Paul makes no mincing of words here. He says, those guys have lost their way. Stay away from them. He said this eats as a canker. The idea here is a word that suggests cutting, going forward, like an auger. It bores its way into the very heart of the gospel and the core of faith. By the time you get done with all of this, you could be saying, Paul, no wonder you said, oh, Timothy. But that's not Paul's last word on this subject. Yes, he knows. He knows all about science. He went to the best school, studied at the feet of Gamaliel. He was as well trained as anybody. He was at the top of his class. But there came a day when he met the Christ of God, and his life was never, ever, ever the same after that. He met him in all of his glory, and all of his honor, and all of his majesty and power. His pride was gone. His arrogance was gone. His authority was meaningless, and he's lying blinded on the Damascus road. But he's saying, who are you, Lord? And the Lord reveals himself to him. Are there fears? Sure there are fears. But there's also a confidence. I would say to you again, this is not Paul the hopeful. This is Paul the confident. 2 Timothy 1:12, he says, I know whom I believed. I am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. 2 Timothy 4:6, he says, for I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I've fought a good fight. I've finished the course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me in that day, and not me only, but unto all them that love his appearing. I think Paul knew he was going to lose his head to some Roman executioner. I think Paul knew that the time was limited, but he's saying to Timothy, I'm marching off into the sunset of this life, but I'm marching into the blazing light of God's eternity. And I'm not afraid. I'm not uncertain. I'm not anything short of absolutely confident. I'm ready to be offered. Paul looks back, realizing it's not been him. Yes, he was a bullheaded guy, wasn't he? He knew the answers, and he wasn't going to let anybody talk him out of it. But far more than that, he knew that it was the enabling sufficiency of God that made it possible. And so he says, oh, Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust. Don't be knocked off the road by vain babblings of falsely identified science. Timothy, keep it. And then he ends up by saying, grace be with you. You know, grace has more than one meaning. And sometimes it's convenient when your theology is you sin every day in word, thought, and deed. You can't live above sin even if you want to, even if you try. It's easy to focus on that something for nothing, getting the opposite of what we deserve. But that's not all there is to the meaning of grace. It's more than just something for nothing. It's the desire and the power to do what's right. The grace of God. God wasn't talking about unmerited favor when he said, my grace is sufficient for you, Paul. He was saying my enabling sufficiency will be there in the darkest moments, will be there when you can't see the way. You hold on to my hand and I'll lead you through. I'll bring you out. I'll keep you true. I'll give you my glory. Grace be with you. So today we don't have any big reserves to give you. We don't promise you fancy churches and elaborate parsonages. We don't have a basic requirement that your salary start out at about $100,000 a year. But I tell you what we do give you. We give you doctrine that works. We give you the enablement of God's power. We give you a loyal group of people who will pray with you and stand with you and be by your side. Grace be with you. May God bless you.
Shall we stand and turn to